Coming up on Harvest today, how to stop your heart from hurting. Licensed therapist Rita Schulte explains how you can find hope and healing through the losses of life in her project, Shattered. And in Israel Up to the Minute, Chuck talks with Brian Bush, who's standing by in Jerusalem with the latest news that's coming out of the Middle East. Also, we want to pray with you today. Write to us or call us with your prayer requests. We want to connect with you. Don't go anywhere. This is The Harvest Show.
Rita Schulte is a licensed professional counselor with more than 12 years of counseling experience to her credit. But despite her training, she knows firsthand the shattering effects of guilt and grief due to personal loss. She joins us today to explain how to find hope and healing through the losses of life. And welcome to Harvest.
Thank you
Rita.
so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Okay, you know, I always say that there's a season that seems to come upon us that seems more real, where loss is more real, and that's around Christmas time. And so now we're in Thanksgiving, and it seems like your project, the timing is perfect. Why would you write a book about grief and loss and the things that we go through when we experience grief?
Well, certainly my own losses were a significant part. But as a therapist sitting with people over the last decade, I seem to notice a consistent theme woven into each person's story. It didn't really matter what their presenting problem was. Loss was always a significant part of their story. And so my observations about those losses made me want to write about it. A lot of the people didn't even realize what they'd experienced was loss. I mean, I remember sitting with a lady one day and listening to her story, and I was like, wow, that must have been a loss for you. And she looked at me and she's like, you know, Rita, you're right. It was a loss. So I was starting to sense that people didn't identify some of what I called abstract losses. You know, we get the big losses, death, divorce, betrayal, things like that. They're pretty concrete. But the more abstract losses, shattered dreams, unmet expectations, loss of innocence, loss of faith, trust, those things were more elusive. And so I wanted people to really begin to understand and notice and label those things so that they could understand and kind of get a grip on how that affected their hearts.
Well, talk to me about your own losses, because I mean, you provide you bring to this project your own feelings, everything that you walk through. Talk to me about those.
Well, the first loss that really broke my heart was my mom's death. And my mom died in my home, in my arms, on my son's 7th birthday. And I didn't think I'd get over it. I had just turned 36, and it was very difficult. Then, as the years passed, I went through a season of successive losses, one right after another. My kids were in a parasail accident where they were struck by lightning, and they didn't die, thank God, but it was very traumatic. It was all over the news and the National Enquirer and everything. And then I had 8 people that were very, very close to me die in the course of a year, and that was really hard. Then my dad was diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer. And that's really when the bottom dropped out for me. I was an only child. I was very close to my parents, and I'd already lost my mom, and so my dad was really like life to me. And so when he got sick, that 2-year journey of watching him suffer, watching him be ill because he lived with us, really just broke my heart, and the bottom dropped out. And I became very depressed. My world got very, very narrow caring for him. He was very emotionally needy. And I began to start having panic attacks. Again, I didn't really realize I was depressed. I had had so many losses, one right on top of another, that I didn't really have a chance to take inventory of my heart. And so a good friend of mine, and she was my best friend at church, she was one of the people that ended up dying, came to me one day and she said, Rita, do you think you're depressed? And I'm like, you know what, I think maybe I am. And so that's when I decided to seek some help, which was key for me, because it got worse and worse as it progressed. And I started having panic attacks, and it was really walking through a dark night of the soul for me.
Now, had you been involved in clinical psychology? And
I had an undergraduate degree. When my dad was sick, I went back to school, and I was on that journey. When the bottom dropped out and I started getting help, I was finishing my undergraduate degree, and the place where I went to get help was a non-denominational ministry called Grace Ministries, and they actually asked me to come on staff as a counselor. And then I decided I was going to go ahead and get my master's degree and pursue this.
So even though you were kind of in that field or preparing, well along the way, preparing to be in that field, still just the weight of the loss of life left you in a place where you really needed help from the outside.
Absolutely. And that's so key for people that are struggling. Everybody hits the wall at some point in their life, and so many of us are afraid to seek help or are afraid to be vulnerable in that way. And telling your story is really the only way to walk the healing path.
What could God possibly be up to? You know, when a person experiences when there are so many losses, 8 people in 1 year, your mother passing away, dying in your arms, your children in a terrible accident, then your father gets sick. I mean, we think that God has forsaken us and abandoned us. Now, we know what the Word of God says, but we know what we're feeling inside our hearts. Talk to us about that process.
Well, I think God is up to a transforming process in our lives. And transformation will flow from 2 sources: the choices we make about how we respond to our pain, and our willingness to be personally responsive to how God's leading us through the journey of sorrow and suffering. And I think oftentimes, we ask, oh, well, what's God up to? We know, what the Word says and all that, but we place a lot of stock on our feelings, I think. And we make our feelings into facts. Because I feel like God has gone to Mars when I'm going through this, that means He has. And so I turn those feelings into beliefs. God's abandoned me. God doesn't care. God doesn't hear my cries for help. And when we make those into beliefs, we act out of those beliefs. And that can have disastrous consequences for our hearts, because if we believe God isn't good in the midst of those struggles, then that's going to determine the outcome of our faith, isn't it? Do we move toward God or do we move away from God?
And what do you find? Do you find that most people do what?
Well, that was something I was really interested in. What makes some people have that resiliency when they go through catastrophic loss? And I mean, I've sat with people that have gone through horrific things. What makes them come through that with their faith still intact? And then other people lose the battle for their hearts with lesser losses. And that's not to compare or minimize, but I was really interested in that. And what I found was there were some common threads. I think the people that make it through tell the story. They bring their lament before God, like Job did. They voice their complaint. They wrestle with God. If they're angry at God, I mean, we think, oh, we can't be angry at God, we're Christians. Well, no surprise to God, He gets that. His shoulders are broad enough to handle that. And I think that in that interaction between us and God, we're doing relationship. We're doing relationship with God, and something powerful happens there. Job encountered God through that discourse, and that was powerful. It was powerful.
Do you think that, just in what you found, there's a difference, and is there a necessity, to bring those complaints before the Lord?
Through.
Well, Rita, we're going to continue this discussion. That's some really good stuff you just said right there. More with Rita when we return from break.
Completely private thing, or is it helpful or is it hurtful to kind of tell your story and air your grievances or your questions and confusion to others as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think you have to broadcast your stuff, to everyone out there. But I think having people walking alongside you is another critical piece. I mean, God created us for a relationship. He's a relational God. We see that evidenced in the Trinity, the creation of angels, the creation of man. He created us for a relationship, and He did that for a reason, so that we would have others that would be able to walk alongside of us. In Luke chapter 32, which is what I talk about, Simon, Simon, Satan is asked to sift you as wheat. So the enemy is out to assault our hearts. I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. The good news is that Jesus is sitting at the right hand of the Father, interceding on our behalf as we walk through these sifting losses that are happening in our lives. And then the third part of that verse says, and Simon, when you've turned back, strengthen your brothers. So you and I are to turn back and to reinvest our hearts with a bigger plan and purpose in mind by strengthening other people and comforting them with the comfort that God has given us as we've walked through.
Well, Rita, we're going to continue this discussion. That's some really good stuff you just said right there. More with Rita when we return from break. And we're back with the licensed professional counselor, Rita Schulte. And Rita, before the break, you were talking about the process of questioning God. Now, I have to tell you, I'm a Pentecostal, and then where I grew up, you don't question God. You just take it for face value, what He's doing. He knows what He's doing. And we do know that, but your heart is so involved, entrenched in the grieving process. But you say it is okay to have those questions, to think out loud. Continue with the process?
Yeah, it is, because God knows our hearts anyway. So it's not like we're hiding anything from Him. And His shoulders are broad enough to take our complaints. If we're angry, we have to admit our anger. We're not doing ourselves any good. If we're angry at God, we have to recognize that. We have to own our anger as our responsibility, and we have to do something with it.
Well, is anger a part of the process, a part of the grieving process? You go through disappointment, grief, anger, denial, and then you come back to reality, or is that a part of the process?
Absolutely it is.
Okay.
Let's talk about what anger is. Anger is a normal response to a blocked goal, a hurt, or a perceived loss. So I got something I didn't want, or I got something I didn't want, and I've got to figure out how to bring congruence to that. I have to figure out, something happened to me. I got cancer. I didn't want that. And I'm angry at God about that. It would be normal to be angry at God about that. The key is, what do I do with my anger? Is it going to be a roadblock to my relationship with God? Is it going to push me toward God, or is it going to push me away from God?
And how is that difference made? What makes one person process anger in a way that propels them towards getting closer to God, find some resolution, versus the other person who uses that anger or sees that anger used to propel them completely away from Him into independence and really isolation?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with choice. A lot of it has to do with noticing our anger. A lot of us are very disconnected from ourselves, and we were taught at an early age, you don't show your anger. You sweep it under the rug. You bottle it up. You don't display that. And so if we do that, if we're disconnected from ourselves and we don't recognize our anger, then the only other opportunity we have is to walk after our flesh with it. And so we're going to, engage in activities like drinking or drugs, or maybe we're going to develop an eating disorder, or we're going to use pornography, or we're going to do whatever we're going to do to, grind that out over here, because we're really not facing it, and we're not facing God with it. And that's why the results can be disastrous if we don't do what we need to do with it.
Okay, so you say that you can find hope and healing through the losses of life, and for some people that's big news. That's a revelation, because they've been so entrenched in their depression. Where does the hope come from? I mean, we want to turn on that light bulb and offer people hope, to let them know that they can come out of it. How do you start that process?
Well, I think noticing is the key. You've got to notice where you are at a heart level. You've got to identify your losses, and you've got to put words to them. But a big thing that you have to grind out is you have to decide some things about the heart of God. You have to decide, is God good, even if the bottom drops out of my life? See, because our definition of good means the story has a happy ending, I get what I want, everybody's redeemed. But is God good if the bottom drops out? And I don't know what the outcome's going to be. And we have to decide about that, because every loss, every trial we walk through is going to bring us back to that question, is God good? So if I know the answer to that on the front end of it, then it's going to be easier for me to navigate through that loss, because I have God now to bring my lament to and to comfort me. But if I don't believe God's good at the heart level, or good to me, then what I'm going to do is I'm not going to be able to surrender to God, am I?
Right.
That's right.
I might be able to surrender some things to God, but there's these other places in my heart that I'm just really not going to be able to give over. And those are the places that need that deep healing. And so I think our concept of God is just huge in terms of dealing with loss if we're going to move through it successfully.
So that issue has to be a settled issue,
Yes.
a faith-based settled issue. Now, the concept of identifying loss, identifying anger, is over and over again in Shatter. It's really one of the fundamental things you're bringing out. What are some of the roadblocks to identifying? Why don't we identify our own losses or identify our own feelings or know ourselves?
Fear is huge for us. We're afraid that if we go to those places of emotional pain, we're going to be totally undone. And I had someone tell me that last week. I'll never make it back if I go to this place. The other thing is denial. Denial is a very, very huge and powerful force. I've been taught to deny it. I put it over here, I box it up, I put it on the shelf, and there it sits, sometimes for decades. I don't deal with it. But then, like you said, another loss comes along. Maybe something not even as significant. And all of a sudden, boom, the bottom drops out. And I'm forced to deal with it. So denial is a very powerful force. You know, we want to play it safe. Avoidance is another face of denial. Okay, I'm going to avoid it. I know it's there, but you know, I really don't want to deal with it, so I'm just going to avoid it. And then control. Control is huge. You know, we want control in our lives. And I think as Christians, oftentimes, we've grown up with this idea that the formula works. If I do A and B, I'm going to get C. And so that predicts outcomes for me. And I feel safe with that. So the loss of control is very scary for us. We feel helpless. And we don't like that feeling. So we need to be willing to surrender that control to God. But again, there we go. If I don't trust God, see, how am I really going to surrender control?
Yeah.
I'm not going to be comfortable with that.
You also talk about forgiveness. And talk about the role of forgiveness. I mean, who are we? What needs to be forgiven or whom?
Well, you know, it depends on our loss. A lot of times, you know, we have beliefs. All of these things develop beliefs for us in 3 dimensions: the self dimension, the other dimension, and the God dimension. So I have to figure out what the loss was. If it was a betrayal, then there may be a person that I have to forgive. If it was something God allowed into my life, you know, something I wanted and I didn't get, or something I got that I didn't want it, then I need to forgive God. You know, not that God needs my forgiveness, but we in our minds, that's how it feels. It may be myself, if I'm living with a regret. You know, if I didn't do something and a loved one died, or you know, my mother died and I had a not so great relationship and I didn't say the things I wanted to say, I might need to forgive myself. And so, you know, it's like if you can imagine having this mesh sack wrapped around your neck and you're adding rocks one at a time into this sack: bitterness, hurt, rejection, you know, despair, unforgiveness. That sack gets pretty full, doesn't it?
It does.
Over a lifetime. And we're carrying that on our backs. And so forgiveness is for our benefit. We need somebody to cut the rope, and that somebody is Jesus. Because if we keep carrying it, a root of bitterness is going to grow up into our hearts.
Well, Rita, would you do me a favor? Look into that camera right there and speak to the person who's dealing with grief or refuses to deal with it. Help them jumpstart that process of, you know, going through the losses of life, and help them find hope and healing.
I think the first thing I would tell you is to pray for a willingness that God would give you the desire to do this grief work, because it's really painful. It's not an easy place to be, the dark night of the soul. But how I would encourage you is, God cares about your heart. Your losses matter to God. He says that so many places in Scripture, over and over. And He wants to walk alongside of you through this dark night of the soul. He's there. His word says He'll never leave you or forsake you. His word says the Lord is near. And so begin the process by just looking at your losses, identifying them, writing them down, and just begin the simple process of putting words to your pain. That's a big first step. Notice the condition of your heart. You know what that is. If there's bitterness there, if there's hurt there, if there's sadness there, bring that before God and let that be a first step toward healing.
Thank you so much. Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you. To connect with Rita, go to ritaschulte.com or go to harvest-tv.com and click on show info. And there you will find a link to Rita's project, Shattered, Finding Hope and Healing Through the Losses of Life. Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
for
much
your
for
insight.
having me.
And still to come, Stephen is headed to the Lissy prayer line where he'll be with Pastor Charles for devotion and prayer. Stay with us.